They stood on the precipice of the unthinkable. 200 commanders of the celestial host, shivering not from the cold, but from the magnitude of the crime they were about to commit. It happened on the summit of Mount Hermon, a peak that pierces the clouds of the Levant, long before the great flood washed the world clean. These were not demons, not yet. They were the elite, the sentinels, the ones entrusted with the stewardship of a young, fragile species known as humanity. But something had shifted in their gaze. The indifference of the observer had rotted into the hunger of the participant. Samyaza, their leader, looked at his brethren and saw the hesitation. He knew that to cross the boundary between the spiritual and the material was to invite a punishment beyond death. The ancient scroll of Enoch records his chilling ultimatum. "I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin." So they swore. They did not simply descend. They bound themselves with a curse, a mutual pact of rebellion. On that frozen peak, the sons of God abandoned their station. They chose flesh over spirit. They chose the tactile, visceral sensation of earthly life over the sterile perfection of the heavens. But to understand this, we must open the pages that history tried to burn. We must look past the sanitized versions of Sunday school lessons and stare directly into the forbidden texts, the Apocrypha. For centuries, the Book of Enoch was lost to the West, preserved only in the deep vaults of the Ethiopian church. It was considered too dangerous, too weird, too detailed for the common canon. Why? Because it doesn't just say, "angels fell." It names them. It gives them motives. It describes a clandestine operation of infiltration. The ancient term is Grigori, the Watchers. Their very name implies their function, to watch. They were the cosmic surveillance state, designed to monitor the human experiment without interference. But the Watchers became the voyeurs, and eventually, the voyeurs became the invaders. What happened next was not merely a spiritual transgression. It was a biological invasion. When they descended from Hermon in the days of Jared, they didn't bring peace. They brought a contamination that would alter the human genome forever. The barrier between the terrestrial and the extraterrestrial had been breached, and the architects of our protection became the authors of our nightmares. The descent was not an invasion of fire and fury, but a silent infiltration. The Watchers moved among the daughters of men, not as conquerors, but as gods walking in the cool of the day. And the texts suggest something deeply unsettling about this interaction. It was seductive. It was hypnotic. But the union that followed was a violation of natural law. When the celestial code merged with terrestrial DNA, the result was a biological paradox. The ancients called them the Nephilim. History often paints them simply as giants, a word that evokes fairy tales and beanstalks. But the Hebrew root nafal, to fall, suggests something far more visceral. These were the fallen ones, or those who cause others to fall. Imagine a hybridization that nature itself tried to reject. These beings were aberrations, possessing the strength of their fathers and the insatiable appetites of the earth. They were not merely tall. They were apex predators introduced into an ecosystem that had no defense against them. The Book of Enoch describes a consumption that defies logic. They devoured the labor of men. When the grain was gone, they devoured the beasts. And when the beasts were gone, They turned their hunger upon humanity itself. The earth began to scream. Yet the physical carnage was only half the catastrophe. The true subversion was intellectual. The Watchers did not just bring their seed, they brought their secrets. Before this moment, humanity existed in a state of primitive equilibrium. But the fallen angels initiated an illicit acceleration of history. They handed us the keys to our own destruction before we were mature enough to understand the lock. Azazel, one of the primary conspirators, is credited with teaching men the art of war. He made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them, and the making of swords and knives and shields and breastplates. Suddenly, conflict was no longer a struggle of stones and bone. It was mechanized. It was industrial. The battlefield became an art form of slaughter. But the corruption was total. To the women, Azazel revealed the secrets of antimony, makeup, the beautifying of the eyelids, the art of seduction and deception. It sounds trivial to the modern ear until you realize the implication. The introduction of vanity, of distinctiveness, of the manipulation of self-image. Other Watchers taught charms and enchantments, the cutting of roots, the knowledge of plants. This was the birth of pharmakia, sorcery and pharmacology intertwined. Samyaza taught spell casting. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations. They were downloading the database of heaven into the hard drive of a primitive civilization. It was a technological singularity thousands of years before the silicon chip. The Watchers effectively broke the Prime Directive. They uplifted a species that was not ready, distorting human evolution with forbidden knowledge. The society that rose from this intervention was likely sophisticated, powerful, and utterly terrifying. The antediluvian world transformed into a realm of high strangeness. Blood flowed like water. The Nephilim, drunk on power and lacking the moral compass of the divine, began to sin against birds
and beasts and reptiles and fish. This cryptic line suggests a corruption of nature itself, perhaps genetic experimentation or a chaotic disruption of the biosphere. The Watchers looked down at their creation, this twisted kingdom of iron, blood, and hybrid monsters, and realized too late that they could not control what they had birthed. The experiment had gone rogue. The signal had been lost.
So, what are we truly looking at when we stare into the abyss of this narrative? Is this merely a parable of moral decline, a Bronze Age warning against race mixing? Or is it the fragmented memory of a trauma our species has never fully processed? Scholars and mythologists see a pattern here that echoes across cultures. The Greeks whispered of Prometheus, the titan who stole fire from Olympus to elevate mankind, only to be bound to a rock for eternity. The story of the Watchers is the dark inverse of that myth. It suggests that civilization itself, our tools, our weapons, our very understanding of the cosmos, is not a human achievement, but a stolen gift, a contraband inheritance left by absentee fathers. This aligns uncomfortably with the modern ancient astronaut hypothesis, yet it requires no spaceships to be terrifying. It speaks to a psychological truth. We are a species possessing godlike technology with the emotional maturity of children. We are still playing with Azazel's swords. We are still mesmerized by the mirrors of vanity. The Watchers may have been bound, but their curriculum remains the foundation of our world. The text of Enoch concludes with a sentence of terrifying finality. The archangels are dispatched. The flood is summoned to scrub the genetic slate clean. As for the 200, they are not granted the mercy of death. They are bound under the hills of the earth in a place called Dudail, a prison of jagged rocks and impenetrable darkness, to await a judgment that spans eons. It is said that they are there still, buried beneath the shifting sands of the Middle East, or perhaps locked in the dimensional frequencies we cannot perceive. They are the prisoners of the jagged rocks, listening to the footsteps of the civilization they corrupted. We like to think we have outgrown these myths. We believe we have conquered the superstition of the past with the light of science. But when we look at our capacity for self-destruction, at our obsession with modifying our own biology, and our relentless pursuit of knowledge, regardless of the cost, are we not still dancing to the music they played on Mount Hermon? The story of the Watchers forces us to ask if the fall was not an event, but a process, one that is still happening. The desert wind still blows over the peaks of the Levant. The snow still caps the summit where the oath was sworn. And if you listen closely to the silence of history, you realize something profound. The ancient world is not silent. It is just waiting for us to listen.